Okay, I think we can start. So, welcome everyone. Welcome to the 19th CPR-CSH workshop. We have the pleasure today to welcome Ankit Bhardwaj and Radhika Khosla. You are not coming from far since you are affiliated with CPR. So, you might be familiar with this workshop. I think you have around 45-minute presentation, and then we'll come to the question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to make a quick introduction and then turn it over to Ankit for the presentation. I'm Radhika Khosla, and I'm a fellow at the Center for Policy Research here. And I think just the fact that we're presenting as part of the Urban Workshop for the first time is sort of it signals the larger work that we're interested in, which is the coming together of urban work and energy and climate change work. And I think this might be one of the few interactions that our groups within this building itself is having, at least officially. So there are three things that we would like to do in the next 45 minutes or so, and this is part of work that Ankit and I have been doing over the last year or more. The first is to just sort of, say why the attention to urban spaces in the energy and climate nexus is important and why it's poignant for India. So sort of what is the space that energy and climate change in cities occupy and what that means in our context. The second is then to describe how Indian cities are responding to climate change. And this is it's an area of growing research, but it's something that we know relatively little about. How do we take all of these different actions that are taking place in urban centers around the country, and what can we say about them collectively? What are the types of characteristics that mark these efforts? And then once we've sort of laid out those broader trends, what we'll do is do a deep dive and sort of go in and explore the case of one city, which is Rajkot. And we've been working there for a while as part of our work with a larger project called Capacities. And there we'll sort of describe how this second-tier city is emerging as a sort of unexpected, perhaps leader is too ambitious a word, but definitely a city that is making strides on climate change in a rather unexpected manner. So we'll describe some of the governance arrangements that the city is working with in order to promote and scale climate efforts. And then we'll sort of open it up for discussion and feedback. So this is work in progress, and we really hope to hear from you too, particularly as an urban community, in terms of how our work is.
Right. Just two more small things to add. A lot of this work actually came out of presenting to the climate change world the importance of cities and the urban. That conversation, I think, is not happening enough in India. And specifically, what we're interested in here is not only increased consumption and income levels that come with urbanization, but also elements like infrastructure development, housing development, transport development that are crucial to energy consumption and therefore climate change. And therefore, the language sometimes that we'll utilize in this presentation will hip-hop between climate change studies and urban studies. But I'll make sure that I explain all the terminology as much as possible. There are two works of progress that are coming together in this presentation. It's actually the first time we're presenting it together. The first is a manuscript that Radhika and I wrote called Urbanizing India in the Time of Climate Change that specifically explores the conundrum of climate change for urban India. It looks at the specificity of the phenomena, but also exactly how the governance arrangement of Indian cities and other urban areas interacts and is dealing with climate change. The second thing is, as she pointed out, a policy brief that's available outside on specifically our case study in Rajkot. So, starting with the magnitude, there are kind of a lot of boosterist, I would rather typify them as, of India's amazing urban transition. I think in many particular ways, people have described this as a way to generate further income, further consumption in cities, but I think the linkage to climate change hasn't been necessarily been made yet. So over the past 25 years, as the graph on the left shows, India's built form has increased by 97%. So in 25 years, India's built form has almost doubled. This is set to double in the next 15 years. right? So we're building at an extremely quick pace, where in the 40-year period that we're in between of, India will almost quadruple the amount of infrastructure and concrete that's being laid on the ground, right? And so this has many implications, one being population growth in urban areas. So by conservative measures which the UN takes, so I mean there's been some great criticism of population measures and urban measures in India from the center here, but even by conservative measures, India will be adding about 404 million people into cities by 2050. Right, that's about the metropolitan, just little than the metropolitan area of Paris each year from now to 2050. Right, so specifically, this has implications for energy usage. More people means more energy. More urbanization means more energy because services ramp up. Buildings require more energy to cool. You need more energy to transport yourself around cities. And why this is important for climate change-wise is because in the next 20 years, the IEA, which is the International Energy Association, predicts that India will be about 30% of the global energy rise. So of the 30% of the global energy rise that's going to come in the next 30 years, India will be majority of that, and because the majority of the economy and people are concentrated in urban India is going to be a significant chunk of that. So just setting up why urban India is important, not only in India, but actually globally. It's going to be about, estimates 20 to 25% of the impact on energy usage. This has real ramifications for climate change. So this graph shows you the population growth that's projected by the UN since the signing of the Paris Agreement. That's projected up to 2050. As you can see, China right now is growing is urbanizing at a much faster rate in population terms, but India will soon overtake China in about mid-2030s. What this means is that post-Paris Agreement, India will actually be one of the most unique, it'll be a unique urbanization process because it'll be in the context of the Paris Agreement. So an argument can be laid out, perhaps not fully analytically, that China's already forged most of its steel, it's laid most of its concrete before the Paris Agreement came into power. India will have to do all of that. It will have to build all its cities. It will have to double its built form, while also under the global imperative for mitigation with the Paris Agreement, and also as per its intended nationally determined contribution to reduce its energy intensity. So historically, this is quite a fascinating set of conundrums falling in place, right? Where in previous urbanizations, perhaps this would have led to an increase in energy usage. India will actually have to do the opposite. It'll have to urbanize while decreasing its energy usage and decreasing its emissions. Specifically, this then opens a very specific conundrum for urban India. It means that they need to think about the development of not only these 404 million people, but the 1.6 billion people in 2050, in conjunction with reducing carbon emissions and reducing energy usage. So this means something slightly different from the perspective of urban history, right? So the classic characterization of how cities think about the environment is that they transition from brown problems to gray problems to green problems, right? So they think of sanitation and local environmental problems like sludge, waste management. Then they transition to gray problems like stormwater and air pollution, which are at a city regional scale, and then green problems of carbon emissions, which are at a global scale. India will not have this luxury. It will urbanize while having to simultaneously think. Thank you. Sorry. It'll have to urbanize while simultaneously having to think of brown, gray, and green problems together. Right? So, just opening up the conundrum for India specifically, climate change not only is important mitigation-wise, but also, as the literature highlights, in terms of adaptation. So, urban India will be at high risk due to climate change, as the work of Aroma Ravi and team at IIHS characterize. Climate risks in cities are multiple, interlinked, and growing. By multiple, it means that cities are facing issues such as flooding, temperature increases, heat stress, increase in disease incidents, and also increase in stress in the hinterland, which also has secondary effects in cities like impact on food supply chains. In this sense, on the graph on the right, Kumar et al. Analyzed about 23 different factors that will potentially put Bangalore at risk to climate change. The ones that come out most are also climate factors like variability in rainfall, which is here, but also infrastructure factors, like area covered by road infrastructure, so paving of roads, which will lead to stormwater issues, but also households that have drinking water connections. So households without drinking water connections will be the ones that are the most vulnerable to climate change. This obviously is something that comes up in the literature quite a bit, especially with the works of like Sarah Hughes, where she points out that climate change is not something that's exogenous to India. It'll specifically bring out risks that will map onto the social inequalities of the city. So those that are the most vulnerable will be the ones that lack the most infrastructure and the most economic access. The second body of work that explores this is the interlinked nature of the different problems. So I think the work of Lele and team at Atri is excellent here. And what they explore here are these kind of complex interconnections between different factors. So specifically, if users arrive at cities, they increase land use in the city, which then affects recharge and runoff, which then affects your local aquifers, which then impacts the water that goes into your infrastructure, which then changes the land use, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So these are complex chains that are feedback loops, that have both negative and positive feedbacks, that are hard to kind of detangle, per se. As Lele and all point out, it's actually also interesting because climate change actually stresses these urbanization systems. So it'll stress the groundwater, it will stress the land use in very particular ways. So how exactly have then cities started to tackle these kind of complex and wide-ranging issues? What I presented so far here is really macro challenges that Indian cities and urban India will face. Specifically, the language of climate change was something introduced by international actors, as we would presume. The Global Cities and Climate Lobby, typified by organizations such as C40, ICLE, and the Rockefeller Foundation, had this moment, around Copenhagen and after Copenhagen, where they were dismayed by the deadlock in international and national negotiations. What they then honed in on was the fact that cities could be a potential site of action. And the argument that they made was that the city concentrates economy, it concentrates energy usage, and therefore if we can use the city as a concentration as a way to, induce change. I think this sits very interestingly with some of the insights from the broader urban governance literature in India. So there's been a sustained criticism of the lack of democracy at the local level. But this was actually something that perhaps, maybe I'm stepping out of the limb, but I think this is something that attracted these international actors because they were interested in these rule of technocrats that were separated from the democratic politics of the national and state governments. Specifically, the work of Suzanne Fisher is very interesting here, where she points out that transnational city networks honed in on cities because they were attracted by this lack of politics and finding win-win technical solutions with city-based implementers. And she specifically uses the term win-win. So while these different organizations, including bilateral agencies and different transnational city networks like ICLE, C40, and ACCCRN, which is the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, try to escape politics and what I want to kind of explore in this presentation was that this wasn't really possible. They had to deal with the localness of the space while they did this. So, as I've highlighted, when efforts begun in, around the Copenhagen era, there was this kind of focus around India being a climate risky rather than a climate responsible actor, and therefore a lot of the efforts initially were about adaptation. So, there's the seminal the Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan by the NRDC, which Radhika was involved with, where they kind of designed a heat stress resilience plan for the city. In Kochi, a combination of actors like IDS, which is the Sussex School of Development, Rockefeller Center, and also the local universities that are focused on ocean research came together and explored the impact of sea level rise in Kochi. So, even though actors came with an international focus, they quickly realized that adaptation is actually a very localized exercise. Indian cities are not facing the same kinds of risks as you would expect, but your focus had to be adapted to the local context. Similar studies were done in Gorakhpur, where waterlogging was the main issue, and in Indore it was water scarcity. In Delhi was a particularly interesting case, as both Agarwal and Hughes argue, where the plan was also was part of this Commonwealth Games furor to make Delhi seem like a world city. And so they wanted to present Delhi as also a climate change forward-thinking city. But because of this kind of broader literature, we see that the climate plan was actually lacking a focus on those that are most vulnerable. So as you can see that, perhaps there was some focus on specific vulnerabilities. These plans didn't necessarily go down and target the most vulnerable populations, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. So from adaptation, suddenly there was this perhaps shift, and I won't say this happened because of the current government. There were schemes before the current government, like the National Solar Cities Mission. But there has been a decided push over the last couple of years, a change in mood where India is taking mitigation a bit more seriously, either because of technological advantage or falling costs or international importance of it. But mitigation has now entered the agenda, and it's also entered the urban agenda. Specifically, not only the Solar Cities mission, which focused on mainstreaming solar technologies in different cities in India, but also the National Mission on Sustainable Habitat and the Green Urban Mobility Mission, which is currently being mooted, are schemes perhaps that don't directly deal with climate change, but definitely have climate change in the back of their mind when they talk about green or sustainable, right? So these are projects and schemes that think about non-motorized transport, that think about public transport, that think about green buildings. Lastly, as a way to frame these issues, as a way to frame the fact that one needs to think about climate change in the context of the localness of the city, the local development needs, academics have used the phrase of co-benefits. And just to step back a bit, the climate change, this term comes from climate change studies, where co-benefits are specifically referred to as climate benefits of development projects or development benefits of climate projects. So these are things that is used to kind of say that development and climate are not antecedent to each other. Perhaps with certain designs of project they can be achieved. And a way to think about this was how can we think of air pollution and climate change together? So this is the work of Sarat Guttigunda in Hyderabad, where he breaks down the different possible strategies a city can take and mapped it out onto if they reduce carbon emissions or increase carbon emissions, and if they reduce air pollution or increase air pollution. So this was a way to kind of, again, localize mitigation activities, to think about the development needs at the local level and how they linked with climate change at large. I think analyses have become a lot more sophisticated now. So the study on the right is by Ahmed et al., and they specifically look at the health impacts of mitigation measures. So, the impacts of urbanization, cycling, increased cycling in the city, increase public transportation in the city, and how that decreases mortality and also decreases household expenditure on energy. So there was a host of kind of studies that use the language of co-benefits, mostly by academics. This wasn't something that was operationalized yet by city makers. Another tidbit was that the Delhi Metro was also funded had some kind of usage of co-benefits under the clean development mechanism with the Japan loan. So now, diving into what exactly are the characteristics, we think of the characteristics of the responses so far in three particular ways. The first, as I've been highlighting and I've perhaps been hinting at, is that local development was prioritized. So this did not mean that climate change was the primary concern that these actors came with, but rather local development was something that they had to forefront in their actions. The second thing was that non-state actors promoted climate-relevant outcomes, but they did not do this by themselves. So when they came into the cities, they had to find local agents, they had to find a local network by which they could work. Lastly, apart from a few very specific cases, most of these were projects. So I've been using the words projects very specifically, in the sense that they were kind of discrete elements in the city. So either one building or one water treatment plant or one sewage treatment plant. They weren't kind of wholesale strategies, apart from a couple of cases. So I'll be breaking each of these down in a bit more detail. So this is perhaps the insight that I think the literature about Indian cities and climate change brings out uniquely compared to other geographies. There are a host of studies that basically argue that climate change cannot be thought of as independent of development, and this specifically plays out in cities in very interesting ways. Suzanne Fisher again points out something interesting, where even the international actors, when they were in the cities, never actually used the word climate change. They always talked about that specific development project they were working on, and then coming to Delhi or going to globally, like in events like COPs, they would present that project as a climate change measure. Partially, this is because of the low levels of awareness or institutionalization in cities about climate change themselves. So on the graph on the left is by Kumar and Gianelletti, where they analyzed 59 different spatial development plans in Indian cities, and they ranked them according to awareness, analysis, and action. This graph is for the awareness component. So as you can see, about 70% of the cities actually displayed no awareness of climate change in their spatial plans. So really, there was no mandate to act upon climate change, and therefore these cities had to think, these transnational actors had to think of more sophisticated methods or more development-oriented methods to mainstream climate change. And so 30% of master plans exhibited some awareness, and only 10% actually had some kind of analysis and action with regards to climate change. So what ended up happening was that these non-state actors coming with the climate change priority at hand actually had to enter some kind of negotiation with different actors, especially the city government, but with different actors in the city, and had to deal with the different incentives that existed in the city for action, and also the different silos of action, and I'll be getting to that in a bit more detail. Something else I want to stress is that I've been using the word development, but development was not necessarily always welfare-oriented. So it wasn't always the case that these plans came down and they targeted areas and spaces where co-benefits were those with increasing the most welfare of the most vulnerable, but they could have been something that came out of the city's influential actors. So bringing on that abstract point in a bit more specific example, in Surat, both Eric Chu and Andres Bloch have described the immense influence of the local merchant communities in the climate adaptation process. So much to the point where a lot of the climate change efforts that the city has been using at the international stage were actually being used to safeguard industrial development downstream and towards the sea level. So these were areas that were more at risk to climate change because of sea level rise and flooding, and they were also the site that were targeted for climate adaptation because of the influence of merchant communities, because they wanted to protect their assets, right? So it wasn't necessarily the case that local development implied that it was the welfare of the city residents at large, but it could have been that, what is described as the local growth machine played a role in orienting where those projects would go. So diving into the Surat case a bit more, the non-state actors had to, again, as I've stressed, had to find a local network. So the Rockefeller Foundation, through their ACCCRN project, identified Surat as an actor. They hired local consultant Taru Leading Edge on this challenge. And eventually, as this is all under the 100 Resilient City mission that I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, eventually they set up something called the Surat Climate Change Trust. This trust was quite a sophisticated financial instrument, because what it basically did was it created this independent body which had some kind of stake of the city government, but then did not need financing approval of the state government. So normally, if cities are to get financial funding from bilateral agencies, they need to go to the state government and seek approval. By setting up this independent trust with some form of stake of the municipal government, the city actually bypassed that, right? And so this actually allowed the city government to steer, as Cook and Chu point out, local and international finance towards climate change goals. And it was actually quite a sophisticated instrument they've used to justify many climate change projects. But as you can see from the steering committee that I've brought out here of the 23 members, it's quite evident why, if you look at it in a bit more detail, why perhaps that site of industrial site was chosen as the main site of climate adaptation. So as you can see, you have a host of government actors here, and then you have the president of the Southern Gujarat Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the head of CREDAI, which is the real estate agency, Gujarat Textile Processors Association, Surat Diamond Association, Federation of Surat Textile Traders Association. So it was kind of the local influential industrialists were very much part of where the visioning process of this adaptation was happening. So, this is not, I guess, just to stress out that this had to enter some kind of local political economy, rather than it being a kind of climate change for all, kind of saving for all process. Surat, though, is a very different, it's almost an anomaly. Very few cities have developed such an institutionalized process. Non-state actors did bring capacity, finance, and resources to plug in gaps. They also brought in convening power. So while departments in certain cities don't talk to each other, these actors were actually bringing different actors. They were bringing the water department with the roads department together. I was talking to one consultant that works in Rajkot, and I'll maybe get into a bit more detail, but he was saying his main job is to run between offices. He doesn't do anything. He just runs between offices and coordinates between the fire department and the water department and the housing department that should be talking together, but don't. So climate change is one way to bring these actors together. Another kind of counter case to Surat's was Delhi's, where instead of it being institutionalized in this particular manner, in this very particular manner, Delhi's own climate action plan came out of a very ad hoc informal process. So it came out of, as Hughes and Romero Lanco point out, It was actually the informal connections of the Chief Secretary's office with local professors and experts that actually made this plan come about. So, unlike Surat, as I was saying that there was an anomaly and there was some kind of broader strategy as to where to dedicate resources, most of the time projects with regards to climate change that are explicit about their orientation towards climate change have been experimental, have been discrete, and have been project-based. I use the word experimental very carefully, and it's been something that's been used in the literature as well, where specifically cities wanted to do a small pilot to generate evidence that this was actually something viable for the city. They didn't want to bite off more than they could chew. They wanted to do something that was implementable, that was manageable, that they can then use to scale up action. So in this ways, a lot of the projects actually took very small measures and have been running with that for some time. Boyd and Ghosh outlined, a variety of experiments that were happening and innovations that were happening in Mumbai. Fisherfolk communities, with mangrove protection agencies, with the railways corporations that were specifically using the language of climate change, but to kind of improve, the livelihoods of fisherfolk, the protection of the mangroves, and railway services. I also want to highlight a specific case that's brought out in a case study by Bulkley and Casanroto. They talk of Z Homes, which is this housing company in Bangalore. And these houses, as you can see, are being marketed as green-rated, highest standard green-rated buildings in the city. This case study is actually a very fascinating insight into kind of the, perhaps an ethnography of the elite in Bangalore, where though, these houses were being marketed as climate change and were a climate change project, a lot of the times those that were buying the houses actually were buying it for a very different reason. And they were buying it because there was a party trick of actually being able to drink water from the tap. Right? So again, I think in a small way, this project, though it was aimed at the elite, was talking about the fact that climate change is not the primary concern. It was actually about these different incentives that you could give to the different actors in the city to take on climate change specific projects. If anybody's wondering, this house is about 4 crores for a 4 BHK. Secondly, there were a couple of kind of Hackenbrock and Boywood talk about a set of community projects, around community farming and green bazaars, perhaps something that we would expect to come out of these kind of projects. But again, as you can see, that there was a certain positioning towards these as towards more affluent members of the city, rather than, again, the most vulnerable or perhaps the more in need. So, what I've outlined here is a story about the linkages that, the different actors have thought of to mainstream climate change in the city. I've kind of laid out that there have been very few cases of institutionalization at the city level, apart from Surat. Most of the projects have been discrete. They've been kind of focused on bits and pieces. They've been aligned with kind of the sectoral work of the different cities, of the different departments in the cities. And so, with this kind of backing, we went to Rajkot. And so I'll be switching to the case study now. And in Rajkot, this is something that we formulated about 1.5 years ago. We actually, our initial understanding was that we're going to go to the city. It's this kind of about 1.3 million people living in that city, and possibly we'll have to work really hard to tell them about climate change, to increase the local awareness, and to find ways, sophisticated ways to mainstream climate change into the discourse. Little did we know that actually they were far, far ahead of us. Right. So this was actually a poster I saw at the local bus corporation. It's also where the title comes from. It was, I think, my second trip to Rajkot. I'd gone to this newly built office right at the periphery of the city. It was a completely empty building, and I was told to go to the 3rd floor because that's where the general manager sits. It's a completely empty building. I had to go to the 3rd floor. And as I walked down the stairs, I saw this poster. So it says Rajkot Municipal Corporation, and we are greener than you think. And I was kind of shocked by the confidence of this. But the more I went to Rajkot, the more I realized this was actually true in a very particular way. Rajkot, unlike other cities that I'd been to, had already been thinking about climate change for some time and had mainstreamed climate change in a very particular way. And I want to highlight that in the case study that's coming. So there are a couple of things that Rajkot did to actually, that were kind of grandstanding or perhaps displaying itself that it was aware of climate change. So the first was that the mayor is part of the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, which is a global board of about 7 mayors globally that are looking and thinking about cities, climate action at the city level. This kind of discourse is very common when you sit with him, where he kind of says that climate change is something that we should do together. There's a lot of quotations of Gandhi and the fact that we shouldn't focus on our needs, etc. The city has been, holding stakeholder consultations regionally of pushing forward the role of cities in climate change. I mean, these are things that even the Delhi government doesn't do, right? So this was something very sophisticated happening in the city. This was a full-page ad the city took out, with what they call advertorials, but they took out in all the metro newspapers to display the emergence of Rajkot as a smart city. And specifically here, you can't see it, but there was an entire section here of the climate change projects of the city itself. So they were very cognizant of the fact that climate change was something important to display that they were doing. And, you know, in a lot of their actions, they actually make that linkage. So then, you know, we really asked ourselves, what was it about the city that actually allowed them to do all this? So we looked at the general monikers, you know, is it a big city? Does it have a dynamic manufacturing industry? Does it have a lot of educational institutions in the area? And the answer was frankly, meh. You know, it was a medium-sized city, growing at a reasonably fast pace. It had a manufacturing hub of about 5,000 enterprises, mostly focused on agricultural products from the regional groundnut, some metalworks, but nothing, you know, specifically related to climate change. It was governed by a municipal corporation, which is, you know, the standard format of governance for million-plus cities in India. But there was a couple of things that stood out. First was the government of Gujarat itself, you know, since Modi's tenure in CM, has been kind of positioning itself as some kind of climate leader. There's a Department of Climate Change in Gandhinagar. They're very active with helping cities. So whenever I go to an event in Rajkot, there's always a representative from the state there, you know, making sure that, you know, that the state has some kind of support in that system. Secondly, ICLE, which is one of the transnational city networks, has an office in the municipal corporation building, sharing a wall with the municipal commissioner's office, right? There's actually a separate door that they can actually go into the municipal commissioner's office in, right? So, and they frequently get called in to kind of either consult the municipal commissioner or otherwise. So there were a couple of things that actually pointed to the fact that perhaps Rajkot was something different. But I still think that really didn't draw into what exactly Rajkot was doing. You know, in what particular way was it mainstreaming climate change into many of its actions? Why was it talking about climate change frequently when marketing itself? And we had to think through that a bit more. And so we thought of it as a framework. And I'll be spending some time with this, so maybe it's best to familiarize yourself with it. So, you know, again, just to draw from our literature, a lot of the Indian cities and actors were thinking about how can we think of climate change in the context of local development actions. So that was one insight we got. The second was that a lot of the projects were doing this independently, right? So what we ended up doing was we analyzed all the city's plans, we analyzed all the city's documents, we talked to different heads of departments, we had multiple interviews with the municipal commissioner, the head of the housing department, the head of the water department, the head of the waste department, to get a sense of what exactly are what we call the city's objectives, right? We found that this, and also part of the smart city visioning process, the city actually laid down a vision, right? So kind of parsing through all these, we found that Rajkot had laid out 27 unique objectives in its different development plans. We've only highlighted 11 here. Sorry. And specifically, we categorize them by environmental, social, and economic and governance. And these are perhaps things that seem very broad, but I think that, you know, it kind of points to the fact that cities are a very interesting governance form because they're dealing with all these different tasks. So I actually call them multitaskers, right? So unlike a line ministry, which are kind of oriented towards certain objectives, city governments are given multiple objectives and have to deal with this in their particular context. So, you know, just to break this down, Rajkot had highlighted it wanted to provide clean energy, it wanted to address climate change in some form or the other, it wanted to reduce energy demand, provide energy access, build affordable housing, enhance safety, improve transport access, provide water access, increase financial savings, increase its own revenue, and enhance implementability. Now, you know, there's a lot to be dug in here. There are a lot of reasons why these objectives are there. You know, there are institutional incentives, they're perhaps the mode of governance that's very, in vogue at the moment. You know, there can be some critiques of that. But I just wanted to kind of lay out what exactly the municipal corporation self-consciously thought of as their goal. And then what we've done here is we've taken different schemes and projects, and we've mapped out how the government, what the schemes and projects first mandate. So in the dark circles are the objectives that these schemes and these schemes specifically mandate in their documents, right? So for example, there's a solar city scheme. It specifically mandates providing clean energy, reducing energy demand, providing energy access. And so basically laying down what's on paper and what their institutional incentives for. In the hollow circles, we identify extra objectives right, that the city implemented, and we'll get into that exactly why that is. So this kind of goes back to some of our co-benefits thinking, right? So the city identified co-benefits of its institutional incentives to then, to achieve more goals. And finally, with the triangles, we identify things that the city can do better. We think that they can actually modify their scheme a bit to actually achieve these things, achieve these goals as well. So this is a framework that we set out in our policy brief. Specifically, we found 3 ways that Rajkot was approaching climate change and responding to climate change. So the first thing I've been stressing from perhaps the beginning of the talk was that it was using local urban objectives as an entry point for climate action. So it kind of identified objectives of the institution, objectives that were relevant locally, and then use it as a way to kind of find co-benefits with climate change. The second thing it actually did a good job of, which I don't think we highlighted enough, was that it was implementing national and state level schemes which have an explicit climate focus. So this kind of specifically draws from insights of kind of multi-level governance, where a lot of the times the good things the cities can do would actually be implementing national and state schemes relatively well, right? So it actually focused on issues that has an explicit climate focus. And lastly, the bit that I find the most fascinating was that Rajkot took schemes that are not necessarily linked to climate change, but then found ways to address climate goals through creative design, through creative implementation. And I think that's the one I'll spend a bit more time in after going through each of them. So with the local objectives as an entry point for climate action, Rajkot specifically found one specific way. And what they realized was that if they reduce energy demand of their municipal services, this will bring financial savings, but also address climate change. Right? So this is a very kind of common tactic, but I think it's to be highlighted, where they realize that there's an institutional incentive for us to save money at the municipal corporation, and therefore we can reduce the demand of all the services we run, and that will also have the co-benefit of climate change. So while they were doing this specifically to have financial savings in their coffers, they were marketing this as a climate change scheme, right? So this actually came out of an ICLEI South Asia project called Urban Low Emission Development Strategies, where they specifically looked at waste and water sectors and ways to kind of the city to be more efficient in these processes and then find financial savings and therefore carbon savings. The one I want to highlight here is the LED streetlight project. So now I think, when I first talked about this project, not many cities were doing it, but I think now most cities have made this transformation, right? But Rajkot is slightly ahead of the curve, perhaps not too much. So what they did was they identified the fact that, they had 55,000 lights that they had to power for the streetlights. And they found that, they could reach about financial savings of about 0.6 million US dollars each year if they made this transition, and save about 7 megatons of carbon each year. And then they tendered it out in a build, operate, transfer model, right? So now that's kind of very common, but I think Rajkot was very early, and they were kind of very savvy in that sense that they kind of did that early on. When breaking down this project in a bit more detail, I asked, what was exactly the motivation, and the municipal commissioner remarked that ICLEI was essential in this. And I think he said something that actually was stuck with me for some time. He actually called ICLEI the local energy department, right? So Indian cities don't necessarily handle energy internally, but ICLEI was doing a lot of the energy analysis for the city. So even to this day, ICLEI handles a lot of the kind of municipal corporation outreach around energy. They have a smart energy portal that they set up, right? So ICLEI is almost treated as part of the departmental organization of the municipal corporation. Secondly, Rajkot focused on implementing state and national schemes with a climate focus. Here, perhaps, and I just want to highlight here, it might be a bit of apples and oranges, because while I've been highlighting projects a lot of the times, the Smart City mission is actually something slightly different, right? So it's more of its kind of broader scheme, it's kind of a broader framework, which then the city fills in with its own proposal. But what I want to highlight here was that the scheme was actually quite explicit in targeting these very multiple issues, right? So unlike previous urban schemes, which were kind of aimed at specific infrastructural interventions, the Smart City proposal kind of laid out a set of guidelines and allowed cities to think across these sectors in creative ways, right? So from a different case, but I was privy to a meeting in Coimbatore where they were having an update on the Smart City mission. And I asked the project manager of the Smart City mission, I asked him, do these people that are from the water department, the waste department, the highways department, the PWD, do they ever meet apart from this meeting? And he said never. So the Smart City mission actually became this point where all these different actors had to come together and chat, right? I think that's something that was a nice bit of the scheme. The solar city scheme, I also think, actually worked really well in Rajkot, right? So the solar city scheme mandated both solar PV in government buildings, but also solar water heaters, and I'll get into that in a bit more detail. So again, with the smart city mission, what I want to stress here was that in the mission statement and guidelines, there were actually out of the 22 guidelines, there were actually 6 to 7 specific measures that actually dealt with things related to climate change, right? So things that would have a positive impact on mitigation. So they included kind of, 10% of the energy coming from solar, energy efficient street lighting, any new building to be a green building. I mean, that's quite radical. And non-motorized transport, non-vehicle street zones, walkable spaces, etc. Right? Specifically on the solar city mission, while a lot of the efforts in different cities have been on putting solar PV on government buildings. Specifically, Rajkot took this bit that was about mandating solar water heaters in all private construction that was incentivized in the scheme, and they actually put it in the bylaws. Right, this was something that was critical. In the bylaws, the city had something that was decidedly about climate change. Right, it was about decreasing energy usage for hot water. Any new private construction above a certain area has to have a solar water heater in Rajkot. And you can see them in abundance in the city. Anywhere you go, they're kind of almost everywhere. And I have many pictures if you're interested in this. But again, the political economy around this is fascinating. So a lot of these are now locally manufactured, right? A lot of the real estate developers are actually actively taking this in consideration while actually bidding for projects, right? So it's not a huge expense, but it's something that they factor in now. And lastly, something that I haven't been able to verify, but one person in the municipal corporation was telling me how there is, a service now that real estate developers and private developers can rent out these solar water heaters during the audit, right? So they rent out these, place them on the roof, and kind of the auditor comes and says, great, good job, climate change friendly, and then they rent it out to somewhere else, right? So these kind of interesting things are happening, but still, we shouldn't kind of stop cities from actually putting these bylaws in, which are actually quite positive. Lastly, cities actually took projects that didn't really have a climate focus and thought of them in the context of climate change. The one I want to highlight here really, and I see I'm running out of time, is the affordable housing for all. So while the main objective of this is to build affordable housing, the city found fascinating design ways to actually extend the scope of this project, right? So this is possibly my favorite part of Rajkot. It's really far from the city. It's not really far. It's about 5 kilometers from the city. You have to pass some green fields, that are used for grazing. And this is a project designed by the municipal corporation, and it was funded under PMAY, but it includes multiple measures that they documented and they designed for that were specifically oriented towards climate change, right? And these weren't kind of sophisticated, high technological measures. And the city engineer, who I think is one of the most fascinating people that I've met, and it's a she as well. She was saying, it doesn't cost much more to lay concrete in a slightly different way, right? So what she was saying was that, we created ventilation corridors, both kind of between buildings and in between buildings. We propose the roofs are paid on a kind of a ceramic tile which reflects heat. It's also proposed to include solar PV. The construction is kind of dense and low-rise rather than the kind of high-rise things that we see traditionally. There were green spaces. I'm not sure how long these green spaces will last, but they're green spaces for now. As you can see, the windows are slightly set back, so it's kind of shaded. And there were, quite big rainwater harvesting tanks and water security tanks in each of these compounds. Right? So these are measures that weren't really high cost, that necessarily did not change the scope of the project, but were quite sophisticated design-wise, and the city did a good job of orienting the PMAY funds towards climate ends. In 2016, the city won the HUDCO Award for Best Innovative Affordable Housing Project under EWS for this project. EWS is Economically Weaker Sections. And when I asked, where were these kind of design measures coming from, she remarked that, she had learned these things at school. So these aren't anything particularly new. They were a part of the kind of engineering education that she had. But she also stressed that she had multiple trips to Leicester in England, in the United Kingdom, which Rajkot has a sister city relationship in, which then was a way to kind of talk to these ideas of green building design. Similarly, SDC has been focusing efforts on enhancing green buildings and architecture design at the city level. sorry, sorry about that. SDC is the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, who is the Capacities Project, which this kind of research is under. So basically now all the houses that Rajkot will construct over the next 5 years, that's about 7,000 a year, will be under these design guidelines, right? So this is something that wasn't there in the PMAY, but because of that little bit of space, so I think we criticize a lot of the times that there's not enough decentralization in Indian cities because, you know, the finance is under the control of the state government, the schemes are under the control of the national government. The architects actually work locally. And that was the little bit of space that the city had power and control over, and that was actually the space where all the climate adaptation came in. Right? So I want to contrast this a bit with perhaps the Z Homes project. Right? So the Z Homes project kind of perhaps exemplifies that climate change is a concern of the rich. If you pay 4 crores, you'll get this extremely, you know, great energy efficient house where you can drink the water out of. But I think the Municipal Corporation of Rajkot presented something where you could buy a flat for 3 lakhs under the affordable housing program and still have some climate-friendly measures in there. So, you know, these kind of projects really showed that climate change and development aren't really separate, but actually have to be thought of together. And I think I'll leave it at that because I'm at 45 minutes. Thanks.